I want to just run through some of the highlights of 3B. The way this lab document is set about is basically what you're going to be changing in the different components of this application. All of these things at this point, all of these components all exist. You've got your presentation tier that has two forms. You've got the piecework input form and you've got the summary form. You've also got two sets of business logic. You've got your piecework class and you've got your senior piecework class objects. So in terms of the input form, because we're dealing with two different types of workers now, you need some added functionality on the form to indicate which type of worker you're entering data for. So I'm thinking a checkbox or maybe a couple radio buttons. There's also a call here for a new label. This new label is going to be used to display a message that is a result of a new event that you're going to be handling. Any changes you make at the presentation tier, make sure that you incorporate those changes into your logical tab order and all applicable keyboard access. In terms of the piecework class changes and additions and the senior piecework, most of these changes or additions come in your piecework class because that's where your property procedures exist that we're asking you to actually add some business rules validation. For the number of pieces entered, you've got to ensure that the number of pieces passed through to the object through the property procedure is within the range of 1 to 1200 inclusive. Anything outside of that range, you're going to throw an argument exception that'll be handled or caught by the presentation tier. You've also got some interesting guidelines here for the validation of the name. You've got to ensure that a real first name and last name have been entered. Now, we're not connecting to a database, so we're not verifying these against a list of existing names, but we can do a little bit of investigation of the string that was passed as a name and ensure that it qualifies as at least a first name and last name. How do we define first name and last name? Well, each component should have at least two characters, and they should be separated by a space. One of those two characters in each case cannot be a period because that would indicate an initial. The next significant change in the business logic is the addition of a couple of events where there's an event in the piecework class called productive, which will basically be thrown should that worker in of a regular worker type be producing at a level higher than expected, and that event would be raised and then of course handled at the presentation tier. And then inside the senior piecework class, you're going to also define an event. This one's going to be underproductive. Those guys were paying, a little bit extra. They're senior workers, and they got there because they were productive at one point, but we want to make sure they're still producing at a high level. So we're going to raise an event if one of these senior workers' production falls below the defined level. The majority of the changes, of course, come into pay calculation and your piecework entry form. First off, because there are going to be events that are going to be handled, which means there's going to be specific handlers for the object events outside of the pay calculation. Right off the bat, our objects have to be declared at the module level or class level scope on the presentation tier. There's a little bit of logic you've got to add to decide whether or not you're going to be dealing with a senior worker or a regular worker. In terms of the calculating pay, this time instead of course your objects are already instantiated, this time instead of instantiating using the parameterized constructor, you've got objects that have been instantiated using the default constructor, and then you pass the number of pieces and the name through the property procedures to the applicable class, whether it's regular worker or senior worker. It's those calls to those procedures that could, in fact, trigger exceptions. So those in the set side of those procedures where you're enforcing those business rules on first name, last name, and the range of pieces, those things could be thrown at this point and should be handled at this point. If they are thrown, then of course check to see which parameter or which argument it is or property it is that threw the exception, and then send appropriate messages and make sure you select all and set the focus in the offending text box. Once we successfully set those properties for an object, you've got to call the find pay method on the applicable object, whether it's a senior worker or a regular worker. And it's at this point where you may actually raise an underproductive or productive event. Should you raise those two events, different messages should be displayed on the new label that you've placed on the form. Some significant changes, some small changes, summary display, there's no changes. Lots here to plan for in the way of changes, and hopefully this walkthrough will help you in your planning.